I'm Dr. Saunders, as you heard. This is the Allan Memorial Institute of Psychiatry. It's part of McGill University. Some people call the Allan a rest home, and in a way, I suppose it is. Actually, the Allan is a rather special kind of hospital. That's why some of the things we do may not fit in with your idea of a mental hospital.
In May 1983, attorney James Turner took the deposition of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb in a lawsuit against the CIA. Beginning in 1951, Gottlieb oversaw the chemical division at the agency's technical services staff. In this capacity, he was, as he put it during his deposition, the administrator of the whole MKULTRA project. Turner represented Velma Orlico, a former patient of Dr. D. Ewan Cameron, founder and director of the Allan Memorial Institute of Psychiatry at McGill University. You approved the grant to Dr. Cameron, didn't you, Dr. Gottlieb? Is that not your signature? Yes, that is my signature. An enlightening summary of MKUltra and its objectives can be gleaned from this exchange. Dr. Gottlieb, did MKUltra involve research intended to develop techniques of interrogation? To the best of my remembrance, MKUltra initiated, supported, and carried out research to shed light to provide information about interrogations. We were certainly interested in what could be done with LSD in interrogations. The point was not, Gottlieb contends, hey everyone, GDF here. If you want to support me, consider becoming a patron to watch exclusive videos that aren't up on YouTube, and you can join the Discord server there. Also, I accept donations. To create a Manchurian candidate. The program never did that. That was a fiction. While the Second World War gave the world the nuclear bomb, the arms race that the world inherited from it rapidly proved to be limitless. Kilotons became megatons, as plutonium bombs became thermonuclear bombs. There was apparently no ceiling to the destruction that the latest weapon could mete out to the world. The Manhattan Project offered a model for a secret weapons program par excellence, the secrecy of which proved extraordinary, its scale and cost astronomical, and its outcome world-changing. The great powers that came out on top in the years immediately following the war proved that an arms race could take multiple forms. Just under 5 years after the war, as many people were still picking up the pieces of their ruined cities, the so-called Cold War experienced its first substantial test. War in Korea, beginning in June 1950, saw the peninsula almost completely destroyed. But by war's end, the Americans observed an alarming and inexplicable phenomenon. As described by John Marks in his definitive history, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the CIA, and Mind Control. By the end of the Korean War, 70% of the 7,190 U.S. prisoners held in China had either made confessions or signed petitions calling for an end to the American war effort in Asia. 15% collaborated fully with the Chinese, and only 5% steadfastly resisted. Worse, an alarming number of the prisoners stuck by their confessions after returning to the United States. They did not, as expected, recant as soon as they stepped on U.S. soil. Gottlieb as well mirrored this concern. When asked in his deposition, why was the agency interested in those techniques such as sensory deprivation, electric shock, and psychotropic drugs, which can cause major changes in human behavior? Gottlieb answered, during that period, we were trying to explain changes in behavior on the parts of returned prisoners of war, on the part of returned internees from Red China, and some episodes of bizarre behavior on the part of American diplomats returning from the Iron Curtain. These, and possibly other areas, were candidates for explaining some of these behavioral changes. The effort to race ahead of the Soviets and Chinese on the science of mind control, or perhaps more accurately, mind alteration, was a broad effort. This is apparent from a meeting between representatives of British, Canadian, and American intelligence services on the 1st of June of the year 1951. Alfred McCoy attaches great importance to this little-known meeting of minds in A Question of Torture, CIA interrogation from the Cold War to the War on Terror. Their discussion set a behavioral research agenda that led to the discovery of psychological torture. A redacted report exists via the National Security Archive. Contrary to any notion of Soviet or Chinese mastery of mind control, through chemical means or otherwise, all present agreed that there has been no conclusive evidence, either from reports of Soviet activities or in Western research, to indicate that new or revolutionary progress has been made in this field. The Soviet pattern is remarkably similar to the age-old methods of interrogation, with only minor refinements toward inducing cooperation. Pursuant to this language, McCoy observes, the defensive pretense for this cruel science evaporated. Instead, these cold warriors decided to pursue control over human consciousness for its own sake, agreeing on a joint research program to further their Cold War operations. Indeed, among those present at the meeting was one Donald O. Hebb, a prominent McGill psychologist, who was to become a pioneer in the field of sensory deprivation. Just 3 months after the meeting concluded, Hebb received a defense grant from the Canadian government. He'd conduct an experiment on male college students, paid to lie on a bed isolated in a room for 24 hours a day. During the whole experiment period, they wore translucent goggles which transmitted diffuse light but prevented pattern vision. Except when eating or at the toilet, the subject wore gloves and cardboard cuffs, the latter extending from below the elbow to beyond the fingertips. These permitted free joint movement, but limited tactual perception. Auditory deprivation was achieved through white noise emitting from headphones connected to an amplifier. The subjects became very restless. Hence, it was difficult to keep subjects for more than 2 or 3 days, despite the fact that the pay, $20 a day, was more than double what they could normally earn. Some subjects, in fact, left before testing could be completed. There was a marked increase in irritability toward the end of the experimental period. A notable effect were the hallucinations reported by the subjects. The visual phenomena were actually quite similar to what has been described for mescaline intoxication, including a row of little yellow men with black caps on and a procession of squirrels with sacks over their shoulders marching purposefully across a snow field. Some subjects complained that their vividness interfered with sleep. The study shows a drawing made by one of the subjects who reported feeling as if there were 2 of him. The results of Hebb's research were published in a 1954 issue of the Canadian Journal of Psychology, tellingly, in a special Defense Research Studies issue, sponsored by the Defense Research Board. Though this study claimed to be concerned with monotonous conditions and lapses of attention which may explain railroad and highway accidents, Hebb himself later admitted that the work we have done at McGill University began, actually, with the problem of brainwashing. We were not permitted to say so in the first publishing. McCoy explains the study in context. Though these results might seem, at first glance, benign if not banal, once refined by further testing, the research discovered a human mental equilibrium so delicate that just a few simple tools, goggles, gloves, and a foam pillow, could induce a state akin to acute psychosis in many subjects within just 48 hours. The implications of this small experiment for both cognitive science and CIA interrogation were in fact profound. Naomi Klein in The Shock Doctrine reveals, a copy of Hebb's major study was sent to the CIA, as well as 41 copies to the U.S. Navy and 42 copies to the U.S. Army. The CIA also directly monitored the findings via one of Hebb's student researchers, Maitland Baldwin, who, unbeknownst to Hebb, was reporting to the agency. In the last interview he gave before his death in 1985, Hebb said, "It was clear when we made our report to the Defense Research Board that we were describing formidable interrogation techniques." McCoy observes that the CIA's psychological brinkmanship would not have been possible without the relevant academics in the field of psychology, indeed calling them the most militarized among the social or biological sciences. Psychology already had a professional mindset that made it a natural CIA ally in the search for new interrogation techniques. Further, the American Psychological Association hosted a division of military psychology, which did Pentagon research, producing such papers as Analyzing the Group Structures of Combat Rifle Squads and Group Effectiveness in Bomber Crews. At the Cold War's peak in the 1950s, the agency cultivated an intimate relationship with this academic discipline, providing critical funding, flying plane loads of psychologists to international conferences, and monitoring the annual meetings of the American Psychological Association for useful papers. One of the main conduits for funding being the Bureau of Social Science Research. The convergence and collaboration between psychology and intelligence is evident in the Manipulation of Human Behavior, comprising a collection of papers from prominent psychologists. Its chapters include the use of drugs in interrogation, the potential uses of hypnosis in interrogation, and the physiological state of the interrogation subject as it affects brain function, where one Lawrence Hinkle Jr. writes, "The effect of isolation upon the brain function of the prisoner is much like that which occurs if he is beaten, starved, or deprived of sleep." Hinkle would be cited extensively in the CIA's infamous Kubark Interrogation Manual from 1963. 10 years earlier, the director of Central Intelligence, Allan approved MKULTRA, a meaningless cryptonym as the standard spycraft called for. The reckless experimentation that ensued, with LSD in particular, indicate a frantic pursuit to harness the chemical's full potential. These early tests involved CIA technical services staff drugging each other by surprise. In one instance, a TSS worker unknowingly ingested, it's impossible to know how much LSD in his coffee. John Marks interviewed a witness. This grabbed him before he was aware, and it got away from him. The man, simply put, was hysterical and ran outside. He reported afterwards that every automobile that came by was a terrible monster with fantastic eyes, out to get him personally. It was a real horror trip for him. I mean, it was hours of agony. It was like a dream that never stops, with someone chasing you. Perhaps this was early enough in the history of the chemical, LSD's hallucinogenic properties were only discovered in 1943, that its powerful and dangerous properties weren't appreciated. On November 18, 1953, Sid Gottlieb attended a retreat with a group of not only technical services staff, but also men of the Army Chemical Corps' Special Operations Division. At the Deep Creek Lodge in Maryland, the men shared a drink, which, unbeknownst to them, was spiked with LSD. One Frank Olson suffered a reaction that lasted for days, in which he was plagued by paranoia, unable to sleep, and barely eating. Frank's depression was dreadful, his wife Alice remembered. 10 days later, he was dead, having fallen, or having been pushed, 10 stories from his hotel room in Manhattan, where he was staying with Gottlieb's deputy, Robert Lashbrook. The circumstances of his death were promptly covered up, and his death was simply ruled a suicide. The agency risked a public relations disaster, but managed to avoid it. Olson's cover was airtight, as even his wife didn't know the true nature of his work, and so the agency continued apace with testing, while pursuing other sources of unwitting subjects. One of these avenues was through George White, a Bureau of Narcotics agent given CIA funds to set up safe houses in New York and later San Francisco. White became the chief narcotics agent on the West Coast. Sid Gottlieb described the safe house on Telegraph Hill. It was sort of a 3-room arrangement with a one-way mirror between 2 of the rooms, and it was a place where White would administer LSD to potential informants or drug contacts. Additionally, they ventured out into the public to dose strangers at restaurants, bars, and beaches. They practiced ways to slip LSD to citizens of the demi-monde while buying them a drink or lighting up a cigarette, and they then tried to observe the effects when the drug took hold. Because the MKUltra scientists did not move smoothly among the very kinds of people they were testing, they occasionally lost an unwitting victim in a crowd, thereby sending a stranger off alone with a head full of LSD. All of this yielded virtually nothing in the way of research toward coercive interrogation, let alone mind control. George White had made as much clear to Sid Gottlieb. His conclusion was, just as an interrogation aid, it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work reliably. The Technical Services Division were clearly enthused with targeting those more vulnerable people. Dr. George E. Ruff of the University of Pennsylvania was another psychiatrist conducting sensory deprivation research, in his case for the Air Force. He was one of a number of attendees of a symposium at Harvard Medical School, with funding from the psychology branch of the Office of Naval Research. In his symposium paper, he'd make an ominous recommendation. Although no studies have yet been reported in which the subject is not allowed to leave the chamber if he wants out, it seems likely that such an experiment would produce behavior unlike that observed where an escape route is available. In June of 1956, Sid Gottlieb personally signed off on MKUltra Subproject 47, which would entail conducting experiments on prisoners at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. In particular, the project sought to evaluate the effects of large doses of LSD-25. Similarly, Gottlieb approved a project led by Dr. Harris Isbell of the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, a federal drug hospital. As director of the Addiction Research Center at the huge federal drug hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, he had access to a literally captive population. Inmates heard on the grapevine that if they volunteered for Isbell's program, they would be rewarded either in the drug of their choice or in time off from their sentences. Most of the addicts chose drugs, usually heroin or morphine of a purity seldom seen on the street. Isbell did one study for which it would have been impossible to attract student volunteers. He kept 7 men on LSD for 77 straight days. "I have had 7 patients who have now been taking the drug for more than 42 days, he wrote in the middle of the test, which he called the most amazing demonstration of drug tolerance I've ever seen. Isbell tried to break through this tolerance by giving triple and quadruple doses of LSD to the inmates. These so-called test subjects, it should be mentioned, were nearly all black drug addicts. With the destruction of numberless MKUltra files in 1973, on the orders of CIA Director Richard Helms, it's quite impossible to know with any certainty the extent to which this testing occurred, where it occurred, whether other deaths occurred, and so on. Despite Helms's effort, John Marks had gained access to some 16,000 pages of relevant files that survived, owing apparently to a filing error in the CIA archives. Marks's files provide the most detailed information that is known of the program, but of course, much of what occurred over the course of MKUltra was not written about in memos filed away in boxes, and little accounting occurred. In this telling document, Sid Gottlieb not only acknowledges the covert administration of drugs to unwitting subjects, but also suggested they stop producing receipts for payments, for example, for sex workers paid by George White to dose their clients with LSD. In short, Gottlieb was suggesting better operational security and secrecy. Another challenge in the documentary history is the lack of government transparency to the present day. To take one eerie example, a 1963 CIA report makes special mention of extremely sensitive research and development programs, comprising 2 programs, A and B. A is the covert use of biological and chemical materials, and B, to this day, is completely redacted. In a great many instances, the work in Field A must be conducted by individuals who are not and should not be aware of our interest. In all cases dealing with Field B, it is mandatory that any connection with the agency should be known only to an absolute minimum number of people who have been specifically cleared for this purpose. In no case should any manufacturer or supplier be aware of government interest. There's also the challenge of the scale of MKUltra. From 1953 to 1963, the program cost as much as $25 million, involving 185 non-governmental researchers at 80 institutions, including 44 universities and 12 hospitals. Following 10 years of MKUltra, the program was evaluated by CIA Inspector General John Ehrman. In a report of inspection for the DCI, Ehrman was troubled with the ethical considerations. The concepts involved in manipulating human behavior are found by many people, both within and outside the agency, to be distasteful and unethical. These included the development of chemical, biological, and radiological materials. Public disclosure of some aspects of MKUltra activity could induce serious adverse reaction in U.S. public opinion, at great cost and risk, with seemingly little returns. As of 1960, no effective knockout pill, truth serum, aphrodisiac, or recruitment pill was known to exist, describing the project as inherently a high-risk, low-yield field of operations. 3 years later, the situation remains substantially unchanged. This report, simply put, amounted to a death blow for MKUltra, and it would be suspended in response. Though this mattered little in the broader history of CIA interrogation, as by then, the agency had already learned much of what they needed to know. In a Senate hearing, John Gittinger, a CIA staff psychologist, explained that by 1962 and 1963, the general idea that we were able to come up with is that brainwashing was largely a process of isolating a human being, keeping him out of contact, putting him under long stress in relationship to interviewing and interrogation, and that they could produce any change that way without having to resort to any kind of esoteric means. Hebb, Isbell, Pfeiffer, Biederman, all of these psychologists bear responsibility in their own ways for the humiliating images from Abu Ghraib, the headphone, goggle, and mitten-bound prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and all the stories we can only read about or imagine in the secret black sites which dot the world map. Another name, mentioned at the beginning, a colleague of Hebb at McGill University, is apparently a pioneer in his own right. As described by McCoy, stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Dr. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method. Years before he ever received his first grant from a CIA cutout fund, D. Ewan Cameron had been conducting experiments that caused his patients discomfort and suffering. In 1934, he published a paper in Archives of Neurology and Psychiatry titled Heat Production and Heat Control in the Schizophrenic Reaction. He exposed some 50 male patients, half of them reportedly schizophrenic, to temperatures as high as 42 degrees Celsius or 107 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1931, he published his investigation of the dehydration method of treatment in epilepsy in the American Journal of Psychiatry. He prescribed, as he described it, a diet of low water content. This amounted to as little as 600 milliliters of water a day, supplemented by diuretics to increase the percentage of fluid excreted. The results of this experiment are haunting. From the first week or so, the patients stole or attempted to steal food or drink on every opportunity. They took snow from the window ledges, water from flower vases, and food from other patients' trays. One patient even died during the experiment. Sudden collapse and death followed. The post-mortem report stated that the heart and kidneys were small, the stomach mucous membrane degenerated with complete destruction in places. Blood vessels were congested, and there were areas of hemorrhage. In conclusion, this method would appear to be of little value. In 1943, Cameron established his research laboratory in the Ravenscrag Mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal. The new Allan Memorial Institute, originally the home of a shipping magnate of the same name, was featured glowingly in The Modern Hospital, as observed by Rebecca Lemov, a professor of the history of science at Harvard. The pages of Modern Hospital and like publications hailed Cameron as a humane innovator, his facility leading the way for the world as a whole. By 1952, Cameron was a prominent psychiatrist, and that year he'd become president of the American Psychiatric Association, a title he'd hold until 1953. In February of that year, Cameron attended the 5th annual neuropsychiatric meeting in Arkansas, where he gave his paper, The Transition Neurosis, where Cameron exposes perhaps some ideological underpinnings in his work. Regarding the extraordinary political conversions which we have seen, particularly in the Iron Curtain countries, the stress required to bring this about, at least as far as the political conversions are concerned, is capable of being developed only behind the Iron Curtain. We have explored this procedure in one case using sleeplessness, disinhibiting agents, and hypnosis. Years later, Sid Gottlieb would be asked to answer for Cameron's treatments by a lawyer representing his former patients. So you were interested in trying to determine what had happened to brainwashing victims, and this research bore upon that question? Gottlieb answered, "I mentioned brainwashing victims in the sense of people who seem to have their very fundamental ideas and behavioral change come out of Korea, Red China, and some changes in behavior of diplomats that were returning from behind the Iron Curtain." The year before his first agency grant, in 1956, Cameron introduced his psychic driving method in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Reportedly inspired by the dormophone, a phonograph and pillow speakers marketed as a way to learn while sleeping, Cameron's version would play excerpts of taped therapy sessions. In January 1957, Cameron's first grant application was received by the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, one of many MKUltra funding conduits. Harvey M. Weinstein wrote extensively of Cameron in his Psychiatry and the CIA, Victims of Mind Control. Victims that include his own father, Lewis, a patient at the Allan Memorial Institute. He explains that CIA psychologist John Gittinger came across Cameron's article on psychic driving and suggested the agency contact the psychiatrist. The agency were doubtless intrigued with the breaking down of defenses analogous to the breakdown of the individual under continuous interrogation that Cameron claimed to bring about. That same year, writes Weinstein, Maitland Baldwin, a CIA-funded researcher in sensory deprivation, visited Cameron in Montreal to discuss isolation techniques, and 3 months later, a grant application was received by the Society from the Allan Memorial Institute. His application included his plan of breaking down of ongoing patterns of the patient's behavior by means of particularly intensive electroshocks, which he called depatterning, followed by psychic driving, sensory deprivation, and continuous sleep. A year after his first grant, while the CIA was funding Cameron's research to the tune of some $20,000 a year, he co-authored a study in the Canadian Medical Association journal on his depatterning method, ostensibly a treatment for schizophrenia. This method consists essentially in the use of prolonged sleep lasting 30 to 60 days combined with intensive electroshock therapy. 26 schizophrenic patients would receive this treatment. The patient sleeps an average of 20 to 22 hours a day and is wakened 3 times a day for meals and toilet. Patients were pummeled into deep sleep using chlorpromazine and several barbiturates. Posturing of the patients by the nurses is carried out every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. After 10 days of this comatose slumber, electroshock begins. The objective of the electroshock therapy is to produce in combination with sleep a condition of confusion, which we term complete depatterning. This battery of drugs and electroshock will render the patient very confused. He asks, "Where am I? How did I get here? And what is this place?" At the advanced stage of the treatment, the patient does not recognize anyone, has no idea where he is, and is not troubled by that fact. He usually shows urinary incontinence and has difficulty in performing quite simple motor skills. Cameron is pleased with this result, as the subject's delusional ideas are completely absent, as are all other evidences of his schizophrenic behavior. Consider the fact that Cameron's work was far from secret. Indeed, his studies were published in a number of prestigious medical journals. Additionally, Cameron was a renowned figure in the world of psychiatry. In 1961, he'd become president of the World Psychiatric Association. These facts can only testify to the realities of medical practice during this grim period of science. Further evidenced by his 1962 study of depatterning, again, ostensibly a treatment for schizophrenia. A survey of the existing literature showed that of the multiplicity of methods of treatment, massive electroshock seemed promising. In its original form, the method consisted essentially of the administration of 2 to 4 electroshocks daily to the point where the patient developed an organic brain syndrome with acute confusion, disorientation, and interference with his learned habits of eating and bladder and bowel control. While in this condition, his schizophrenic symptoms disappeared. In favorable cases, the schizophrenic symptomatology would not reappear. I insist on mentioning here that Cameron cites a number of other doctors conducting similar research. Kennedy and Ansel described their patients as being brought to the level of 4-year-old children. Rothschild and his coworkers referred to certain of their organically disorganized patients as being unable to swallow, but able to suck fluid from a feeding bottle. Gluck reported that his patients were like helpless infants. They were incontinent in bladder and bowel and required spoon feeding as well as tube feeding. Cameron shares the results of his experiments, ranging from loss of a second language or all knowledge of his marital status. In more advanced forms, he may be unable to walk without support, to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence. At this stage, all schizophrenic symptomatology is absent. The year before, Cameron authored a study included in a symposium on psychophysiological aspects of spaceflight, funded by the U.S. Air Force. Its focus was a reduction in sensory input. His pursuit of a cure for schizophrenia is not apparent in this study, and in fact, it notes how another researcher compared sensory deprivation and schizophrenia and states that he feels that it produces the primary symptoms of schizophrenia. The research conducted at the Allan Memorial Institute included the following. Patients were in a darkened room with goggles, and their ears were covered with rubber eardrums into which was led white sound. White sound was also led into the room. The arms were covered with cardboard cylinders. The patients were fed and toileted in the rooms. The nurses had instructions to reduce all communication to a minimum, and the timing and composition of the subjects' meals were changed unpredictably. Soup might be given for breakfast. The duration of stay in such sensory isolation was increased to a maximum of 16 days. The authors describe administering Sernil, a brand name for pharmaceutical PCP. With our psychoneurotic subjects, Sernil produced apathy, then anxiety, followed by disturbance of body image, feelings of unreality, and depersonalization. Further on, the electroshock therapy so favored by Cameron is applied not as a treatment for schizophrenia in this case, but merely as a foray into sensory deprivation. One can only imagine being placed in the conditions already described, in pitch blackness with goggles and cardboard tubes on your arms for days, along with the lack of physical and auditory input, now followed by massive electroshock to a point where marked degrees of confusion occur. At the point where electroshock is beginning to interfere with the maintenance of the space-time image, there occurs marked anxiety and often hostility. The authors call this complete depatterning. To their satisfaction, they conclude that a basic activity of all human beings is to maintain and extend control over their internal and external environments. Where this control is interfered with, anxiety constantly appears. A further conclusion, no doubt relevant to the men of the technical services staff at CIA, behavioral changes can be produced in adult human subjects by exposure to reduction in sensory input. They even list ways in which reduction in input can be achieved. Relevant information, again, not in the treatment of schizophrenia, but perhaps relevant to interrogation. Gordon Thomas provided an enlightening find in his Journey into Madness, an interview with Dr. Cameron from a 1955 issue of Weekend Magazine, a popular Canadian tabloid. The article dealt specifically with beneficial brainwashing, saying Dr. Cameron was credited with inventing a daring idea designed to help neurotic patients by using a modified form of brainwashing. Quoting Cameron, he had added he was confronted with the same problems as professional brainwashers because his patients, like prisoners of the communists, tended to resist and had to be broken down. A central problem with Cameron's claims of treating schizophrenia is the fact that patients of his were given depatterning, psychic driving, and sensory deprivation treatments without ever having been diagnosed with schizophrenia at all. In fact, some patients were simply anxious, perhaps in an unfortunate marriage, or suffering from postpartum depression. Cameron's patients were typically women. One dubious treatment involves a 28-year-old married woman admitted for the second time. Her first admission had been in May 1956, owing to a personality change. She claimed she often talked with God and occasionally with the Virgin Mary. Later, she became rather moody and ultimately frankly delusional. Unfortunately for the patient, She continued to believe the prophecy of a nun who had allegedly told her some years ago that her husband was to die during a foggy and misty period. In April 1959, she was extremely paranoid and would see significance in the way a book lay on a desk or a pencil was moved. She still continued treatment on an ambulant basis, but eventually had to be readmitted when she became quite unable to carry out her housework any longer, after which it was decided to depattern the patient. This story was included in a paper in which Cameron describes inducing amnesia through his depatterning, from a February 1960 issue of Comprehensive Psychology. The usual treatment plan employed is to put the patient on prolonged chemical sleep and immediately to start electroshock therapy. Some patients have been treated up to 65 days in continuous sleep. The average amount of ECT given is 20 to 30 electrical treatments, but a number of the patients have received considerably more than this. After this, there is complete amnesia for all events of his life. Patients were also given several counteracting drugs, including sodium amytal, a barbiturate, and digoxin, a brand name for methamphetamine. Similarly tragic is the case of one Mary C., her full name apparently a mystery. John Marks secured the doctor's notes from Mary's treatment from the APA archives. As Marks describes them, the aloof psychiatrist wrote in his notes, although the patient was prepared by both prolonged sensory isolation, 35 days, and by repeated depatterning, and although she received 101 days of positive driving, no favorable results were obtained. The 52-year-old Mary C. had apparently been diagnosed with the following: conversion reaction in a woman of the involutional age with mental anxiety, hypochondriac. In other words, Mary C. was going through menopause. Naomi Klein interviewed former patient Gail Kastner in her home. She was barely mobile, as violent convulsions from electroshocks had riddled her spine with small fractures. Gail's medical files tell a heartbreaking story, one as much about the limited choices available to an 18-year-old girl in the 50s as about governments and doctors abusing their power. She is a McGill nursing student, excelling in her studies, whom Cameron describes as a hitherto reasonably well-balanced individual. She is, however, suffering from anxiety, caused, Cameron plainly notes, by her abusive father. After several weeks of his regimen, Cameron himself noted, the shock treatment turned the then 19-year-old honor student into a woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed from a bottle, and urinated on the floor. In the Journal of Mental Science, D.U. and Cameron wrote specifically of his psychic driving. The treatment entailed alternating between negative signals and positive statements. A negative recording from a therapy session played through pillow speakers or a helmet in some cases may include, now that you have 2 children, you don't seem to be able to manage them and keep a good relationship with your husband. You are drifting apart. You don't go out together. You have not been able to keep him interested in you sexually. A positive statement: begin to assert yourself first in little things. You will then be free to be a wife and mother just like other women. It's little surprise that it was found that the individual, after undergoing repetition for quite brief periods, experiences increasing discomfort and seeks to move out of the area of exposure. In order to keep the patient under the particularly long periods, 20 to 30 days for 16 hours a day, found requisite to achieve maximal incorporation of our signals, it was necessary to develop specific means. These means had to ensure that he stayed in the area of repetition whilst he remained maximally receptive. For that, they'd use PCP and chlorpromazine. The PCP reportedly produces underactivity because of its effects on the motor system. The negative phase is carried out until the patient shows growing rejection of the statements. This usually takes about 10 days. The tape running from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. A pillow speaker is used. The positive phase is ordinarily carried on for another period of 10 days. We have attempted to intensify the effect of the negative phase by applying galvanic simulation, i.e. electrocution, to the leg, this being synchronized with the end of each negative repetition. Over a typical 20-day period, a patient would be forced to listen to these statements up to 500,000 times. To summarize, the authors write that this driving can bring about a personality change. Repetition is shown to be a powerful force in producing change by mechanisms other than those hitherto recognized. Leonard Rubenstein was Cameron's lab assistant. his salary apparently covered totally by CIA funds. Years after Cameron's death, and after the fallout from the Church Committee that exposed MKUltra to the eyes of the world, Rubenstein would be interviewed by the New York Times. In a story on the use of private institutions and hospitals, DU and Cameron's Allan Memorial Institute was prominently featured. It was directly related to brainwashing, he said about the project in a telephone interview. They had investigated brainwashing among soldiers who had been in Korea. We in Montreal started to use some of these techniques, brainwashing patients instead of using drugs. Much had been tried in the pursuit of a revolutionary mind-altering chemical, insofar as it revealed secrets or acted as a sort of lie detector for prospective spies. On this front, the CIA learned virtually nothing, though MKUltra has a lasting legacy for a reason. Indeed, now that drugs were known to be unhelpful, the agency could contribute its attention and resources to the grim science of isolation and sensory deprivation that came to define the CIA's means of torture. These methods would form the basis of interrogation for intelligence agencies the world over. They've come to characterize, to this day, the reality for those swallowed up by the shadowy netherworld of secret police, civilian spies, or murderous paramilitaries. Indeed, though LSD dominated the early MKUltra research, McCoy writes, gradually, as drugs failed to deliver useful results, the agency's mind control project shifted to more mundane behavioral research, which has generally been ignored by scholars and journalists entranced by the red herring or public bogey of esoteric LSD testing. Yet it was this process of academic trial and error through countless psychological experiments, all dutifully and duly reported in scholarly journals, that produced the real breakthroughs in the CIA's search for effective interrogation techniques. With the program coming to a close in 1963, the results of this macabre research were published in a consequential manual known by its cryptonym Kubark. The alliance between the CIA and some of the most prominent names in the fields of psychology and psychiatry culminated in a manual called Kubark, circa 1963. Which formed the basis of an agency training program that ran for about a decade. Its methods, however, endure to the present day. The manual reads as a sincere attempt to intellectualize the infliction of pain. One can find numerous traces of the McGill experiments. All of the techniques employed to break through an interrogation roadblock, the entire spectrum from simple isolation to hypnosis and narcosis, are essentially ways of speeding up the process of regression, prompting a slip back from maturity toward a more infantile state. Indeed, all coercive techniques are designed to induce regression. The aim is to produce discomfort. The prisoner should not be provided a routine to which he can adapt and from which he can draw some comfort, or at least a sense of his own identity, which can be achieved through manipulation of time by retarding and advancing clocks and serving meals at odd times, 10 minutes or 10 hours after the last food was given. In a section dealing with deprivation of sensory stimuli, the manual concludes, the more completely the place of confinement eliminates sensory stimuli, the more rapidly and deeply will the interrogatee be affected. Results produced only after weeks or months of imprisonment in an ordinary cell can be duplicated in hours or days in a cell which has no light, which is soundproofed. As we've seen, an early effect of such an environment is anxiety. The interrogator can benefit from the subject's anxiety. As the interrogator becomes linked in the subject's mind with the reward of lessened anxiety, the questioner assumes a benevolent role. The manual reveals the principal and most consequential realization following the research in interrogation. The available evidence suggests that resistance is sapped principally by psychological rather than physical pressures. It's worth noting that the CIA appear to have dispensed with many of Cameron's innovations in torture, a fact that testifies to the unimaginable suffering endured by his patients. Cameron's work took the concepts of brainwashing to their logical extreme, showing that there is seemingly no limit to the human imagination or its capacity to create new iterations of suffering. Klein writes, wherever the Kubark method has been taught, certain clear patterns, all designed to induce, deepen, and sustain shock, have emerged. Prisoners are captured in the most jarring and disorienting way possible, late at night or in early morning raids, as the manual instructs. They are immediately hooded or blindfolded, stripped and beaten, then subjected to some form of sensory deprivation. This was not, of course, all the influence of Cameron or MKUltra. Torture is always an improvisation, a combination of learned technique and the human instinct for brutality that is unleashed wherever impunity reigns. McCoy additionally notes the changing nature of torture. Perpetrators can suffer a dangerous expansion of ego, leading to escalating cruelty and lasting emotional disorders. Though any ordinary man or woman can be trained to torture, every gulag has a few masters who take to the task with sadistic flair, abhorred by their victims and valued by their superiors. Applied under the pressure of actual field operations after 1963, psychological methods soon gave way to unimaginable cruelties by individual perpetrators whose improvisations, plumbing the human capacity for brutality, are often horrifying. In September of 2003, a memo signed by Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez offered a list of interrogation techniques. Included are a number of clear measures aimed at interfering with a prisoner's sense of environment and self, including convincing the detainee that the interrogator has mistaken detainee for someone else, removing the detainee from the standard interrogation setting and placing him in a setting that may be less comfortable, dietary manipulation, changing the diet of a detainee, as well as environmental manipulation, altering the environment to create moderate discomfort, such as adjusting temperature or introducing an unpleasant smell. Of course, isolation, not to be used for interrogation purposes for longer than 30 days continuously. Sleep management, detainee provided minimum 4 hours of sleep per 24-hour period. Sensory deprivation, use of isolation and sleep management to disorient detainee and prolong capture shock. Yelling, loud music, and light control used to create fear, disorient detainee, and prolong capture shock. And another CIA routine, stress positions, use of physical postures, sitting, standing, kneeling, prone, etc. Following Sanchez's memo in October 2003, the Red Cross visited the prison at Abu Ghraib, and in their subsequent February 2004 report, described seeing persons deprived of their liberty presenting signs of concentration difficulties, memory problems, verbal expression difficulties, incoherent speech, acute anxiety reactions, abnormal behavior, and suicidal tendencies. These symptoms appear to have been caused by the methods and duration of interrogation. One person held in isolation that the ICRC examined was unresponsive to verbal and painful stimuli. Just weeks after the Red Cross report, the New York Times obtained internal FBI emails from agents who had spent time at Guantanamo Bay. One of them gives a brief summary of what I observed at Gitmo. As we've seen, even DU and Cameron allowed for a break from isolation for patients to go to the bathroom. On a couple of occasions, I entered interview rooms to find a detainee chained hand and foot in a fetal position on the floor, with no chair, food, or water. Most times they had urinated or defecated on themselves, and had been left there for 18 to 24 hours or more. On another occasion, the AC had been turned off, making the temperature in the unventilated room probably well over 100 degrees. The detainee was almost unconscious on the floor, with a pile of hair next to him. He had apparently been literally pulling his own hair out throughout the night. James Yee, a former Army captain, gives haunting testimony from his time at Guantanamo Bay. The most traumatized detainees were kept in Delta Block. It was equipped like the others, but its occupants seemed to constitute a psychiatric ward rather than a prison block. The prisoners here were truly mentally disturbed. At any time, at least 20 prisoners were being kept in Delta Block. Detainees exhibited a wide range of strange behaviors. Many of them acted like children. I'd stop to talk to them, and they would respond to me in a childlike voice, talking complete nonsense. Many of them would loudly sing childish songs, repeating the song over and over. Some would stand on top of their steel bed frames and act out childishly. The prisoners here were allowed the privilege of paper and crayons. They'd lie on the floor or on their beds, drawing pictures. The nurses let them hang the pictures on their cage wall, and every cell was plastered in pastel drawings of animals, the guards, their cells, and mosques. A mental health expert later explained to me that an adult who takes on the attributes of a child is suffering from regressive behavior. It affects people who have been so traumatized by prolonged stress that they lose a sense of themselves and revert to the mindset of a child.